Alrighty, this is Jerry Diamond. Diamond's Log Arc Date 2015-1-10, and we're reading How to Get Out of Babylon. Without comment. My tongue may be bloody by the time I'm done, but I know I should just read it through, just the book, and then I'll do a second edition with comments and updates, and if I can do that clear enough and precisely enough, allocution-wise, that maybe I can get it to transcribe and get a second edition put out, or volume 2, or whatever the heck, follow-up. How to get out of Babylon. How to get Babylon out of you. Boy, I got people out of Babylon, my family here, but man, Babylon is right here. Holy crap. It's like the closer we get to the kingdom, the further people are running away, the brighter the lights shine, and the tighter they close their eyes. Jeez. 3-foot spoons, people, 3-foot spoons. You got to figure out what you're going to do with that spoon on your hand. I'm going to come back to that over and over, man. That is the simplest, clearest, most concise, most crystallized way of describing what we're being faced with. If we don't all make it, ain't none of us going to make it. I'm here to tell you. When we get surrounded by hordes of invading peoples from every nation on this planet that hates our guts, read Psalm 83. It's right there. Psalm 83. Read it. Read it. Read Psalm 83. That's what's going to happen. The men of Moab with Hagarenes are there. See Jebel Amalek. They're all going to come in here. They're all going to be here. Gog, Magog, Togarmah. Many peoples with them. Ain't going to be no hope for anybody unless we all help each other. Survivalist lone wolf McQuaid type crap is for the birds, and it's going to take everybody down to hell that tries to live that way. Alright, no commentary. No more commentary. I'm going to read now. Alright. Exercise your tongue. Alright. Section 1. Solutions to problems. So much Christian, patriot, and prophetic information tends to be truthfully informative, but also alarmist and downright frightening. It is hard not to be. The ugly facts of the deplorable condition we have degenerated into as a nation and as a church, quote unquote, is truly sickening and terrifying. However, I once heard Bob Spears, a preparedness leader, say that in the military, an officer should never bring a problem before his commander unless he has developed, quote, at least 2 workable solutions to the problem, end quote. There is no need for me to recount how deep the mire is into which we have sunk. What follows is a plan to achieve survivability for many, or as many, who desire to obey the command to flee, literally, to use John Bunyan's phrase, the city of destruction. As in the introduction to the novel Systemic Shock by Dean Ing, part of a trilogy, I know that there is another workable, albeit, although less desirable solution. Introduction. Things were getting bad quickly, but Americans knew there would be a solution. There was. It found 100 million Americans. It was called sudden death. End quote. What I envision is a way to avoid that for as many as will listen. 12 years ago, I made up a saying which came from my assessment of the situation as I saw it. It is still true. A lot of people are going to die because they thought they were smart enough to think for themselves. Recently, we watched the movie, The Druids, about Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix, Bercingetorix. The great leader in Gaul who stood up to the Romans. The people failed to heed the wisdom of his advice. and so thousands upon thousands of them were slaughtered. My son turned to me and pointed out that, quote, "It is what you have been saying, Dad. A lot of people die when they think they are smart enough to think for themselves." End quote. Often we need to subject our intellect to that of another greater or more informed mind. I deliberately did that and ended up where I am now after 4 years in Kansas, boot camp, quote unquote, quote, boot camp for Missouri, end quote, as my wife says. This booklet will comprise a mere outline of a plan to help people to relocate from the cities out into the country and to begin to build and attempt to live on the land. It is intended not so much as an argument to convince believers to do so, but as a guide for those who know that we are in the last days and who know that, quote, hard times, end quote, are soon to come. Okay? Survivalist versus survivor. To begin with, we have the survivalist who is living in the city. He has his bucket of wheat along with his book on how to live on a bucket of wheat and no electricity. True book. He has a good-to-go pack, a bug-out bag, a good bag, get-out-of-Dodge bag, his survival pack. Now, please understand, I'm not knocking those things. That is pretty much where we were at for 20-some years, 27 years. We were accumulating a large number of things with no better plan than to head, quote, head for the hills, end quote, when, quote, his posterior excrement began to impact the rotating oscillator, end quote. But you have that city person versus the farmer or rancher who has grown up on the land and lived out in the country his entire life. He has a well, a septic tank or a lagoon, chickens, a garden, a milk cow perhaps, some goats, and maybe a greenhouse. He runs cattle, perhaps grows corn, as well as hay for his cattle. Now I ask you, what is the difference between those two insofar as surviving goes? Which one is in a better situation, a more survivable situation? It takes many people years to understand that the survivalist, quote unquote, is merely that. He is a survivalist. He is not a survivor. There were many survivalists, quote unquote, leaving fingernail marks on the outside of Noah's Ark. Bloody fingernail marks. Noah was a survivor. We need to have an ark. We need to be survivors, living and working in a survivable area, not mere survivalists whose last-minute plan is not workable for even 1 out of 1,000 people. What is true wealth? Next, you transition from the concept or attitude of us for and no more versus that of beginning to look at the ability to keep other people alive. These people might be friends, family, fairly new acquaintances, or they might be complete strangers. They may be refugees when it comes down to that. One truth which we would do well to keep at the forefront of our plans is a statement by Buckminster Fuller. For anyone who does not know who Fuller was, he designed the geodesic dome and thousands of other inventions. He was a very far-sighted man, a Solomon of his generation, of our generation, of the last 200 years, 500 years, insofar as his inventiveness went. He said this, we now know what true wealth is. He said this, quote, we now know what true wealth is. True wealth is the ability to regenerate forward life. In other words, how many people can you keep alive for how many days? End quote. Now, I would ask that question of anyone who is reading this booklet or listening to this booklet. You may own a $500,000 home. You may have a $5 million estate. I don't care if you're worth $500 million. But if all you have is paper money and bricks and mortar and stone, with maybe green grass out front when the water is working, shut up, commentary, and an SUV in the garage, you really have nothing. I ask you this question: do you have the ability to regenerate forward life? As a believer, unless you are willing to put the things you quote-unquote own to work for the building of the kingdom of heaven, of Zion, you are not wealthy. I've said for many years that someday things are going to be turned upside down, topsy-turvy. When the economy crashes or whatever happens, how many people can you keep alive for how many days? If your answer is 0, then you're not wealthy. The sum total of everything you own will be worth nothing. There will be people who were relatively poor who will suddenly be wealthy because they have true wealth. An example of true wealth. To put it into a different perspective, let us look at something that happened to us. We were going to be moving, and while we were visiting, we went to look at land that a friend of ours was planning to buy. This is the person that we would be working with. He had a large family. They lived in the country with a garden and chickens. They lived as close to the land as they could, and they had a vineyard. They had the ability to make vinegar and wine. They had good neighbors around. They were surrounded by good people, and they were working with good people. They had a business from which they could ship product nationwide. We were sent to see the land. We went to see the land. And as we were driving away, we hadn't gone but a quarter of a mile, and my son, same one that said about Vercingetorix, who was 17, said something very insightful to me. Now, you have to understand that he and I traveled all over the country during the Y2K concern expos. We did expos in many major cities. We met some wonderful people. I met some very wealthy people who were literally millionaires. They had visited the White House and were big supporters of political candidates. We have done work in million-dollar homes. My son has met some very influential, very great leaders and very wealthy people. As we were pulling out of there, he said, "You know, Dad, of all the people that we have met in our entire life, Kent is the wealthiest man that we know." And I'm not going to apologize for that one, because it's one person I really miss. That man was a visionary and a strategist and a tactician, and a huge loss. By and large, I'm not going to have any commentary, but he is the person that God used to bring me here, and I owe him and his family. And his community. More than I'll ever be able to repay. Okay. Ken is the wealthiest man that we know. End quote. And this is true because he had the ability to regenerate forward life. That was true wisdom and insight on my son's part. A biblical example of true wealth. Now, to put it in another light, the classic example is that of the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph, when explaining the dream and then being asked to put that dream into practice, stored up what? He did not stock up gold or silver. He stored up food. And what did that in turn become? He stored up the ability to keep people alive. He stored up the ability to regenerate forward life. And so when famine came, people came to him and traded their money, their goods, and their land for food. He stored up the ability to regenerate forward life, and that became wealth. What people consider wealth. Gold and silver. But the true wealth was in the food, or the ability to regenerate forward life. And in doing that, I might point out, he saved his own family. He saved the entire house of Israel. So the life of the patriarch Joseph is the most powerful illustration we have of what I'm trying to get across here. Next section, meat on the hoof and crops in the ground. This is where we need to be headed if we want to consider ourselves wealthy. We need to have food, and it needs to be food that is growing. The best form of food preservation is meat on the hoofs and crops in the ground. Another experience my son and I had way back when we were in Denver happened in a restaurant which counterculture types often frequented. You know, you'd have radicals and patriots and militia people, all kinds of different people. This one gentleman was sitting up at the counter, and we were sitting at a booth. He was talking to somebody about his investments and buying stock in DIA, Denver International Airport. I made a comment out loud to him while they were talking. Later I made another comment out loud, and so a while later, after his friend left, he came and sat down at the booth with us and told us about how you could get a 10% discount on Canadian gold maple leaves if you drove to Canada and bought $250,000 at a time. So I slapped my son and said, "Ian, what are we waiting for? Let's go." The garden was worth more than the gold. He did recognize, however, that while talking about buying massive amounts of gold coins and knowing people who did, that gold is not true wealth when times are hard. He told us about Germany in World War II and how people would come down the country roads and see a farm with a garden, and they would come up to the door of a farmhouse and they would knock on the door. When the farmer would come to the door, they would offer to buy food with gold, and they were sent on down the road. The man said 3 times, the garden was worth more than the gold. The garden was worth more than the gold. The garden was worth more than the gold. I think it was an angel. No commentary. We need to have food in the ground. We need to have gardens, orchards, vineyards, olive yards, bees, goats, chickens, and cattle. We need to have meat on the hoof and crops in the ground. I wrote a poem some time back, and it is entitled, Alas, Babylon. This was written about the time of Pentecost. Alas, Babylon. In wrath, remember mercy, the prophet Habakkuk pled. Their judgments are our blessings, is how that could be read. Were not 3 million people by plagues from Egypt freed? May we, by Yahweh's catastrophes, from Babylon us lead. Yea, it would be wise to heed the writing on the wall, relocate our families before the empire's fall. We'll learn to grow a garden worth more than lifeless gold, build our new communities, and our new borders hold. Cut your losses, burn your bridges, you'd better do it now. Relocate your family before the empire's fall. Oops, sorry. Where in the heck is that? Cut your losses, burn your bridges, you better do it now. Don't look back, escape the fire, put your hand upon the plow. It takes some time to settle in, be trusted, learn the ropes. We must build a house and grow some crops if we're to live our hopes. The war we fought for freedom 200 years ago dragged on for 8 long, dark years. hunger pangs did many know. Will never last the coming wrath unless our storage food abound, and that is meat upon the hoof and crops within the ground. It is not just for us, for no more from our stores we'll have to draw. Shan't we our brother's keepers be, thus obeying Bible law? Would Joseph have been blessed of God with an attitude like that? See the world starve to death while only the rich grew fat? But no, in blessing all the world, he reached his own family too, thus saved all Israel from death, and received the double birthright too. America is Joseph's house, Manasseh tribe by name, and parts of all the other 12 who gather in his name. For Shiloh soon is to return, whose right it is to rule. He'll crush the Nathans with his law, and in righteousness a school. It falls to Joseph once again to savior all the rest. Thus the entire world looks on as we begin the test. Our test begins right now to use what we thought we owned, to build a kingdom we can't yet see with what God to us has loaned, to lay our every resource down in sacrifice before his feet will seem as nothing when at last the nail-scarred man we meet. He will not own you then if you do not own him now. Obey his word, escape the world, and yes, begin to plow. If with his image our children will fill up all the world, the millennial kingdom will have come, his glorious banner unfurled. Yeah, relook over from the other. Sorry. I was looking back at that. I re-quoted the relocate our families before the empire's fall. I was like, what? I wondered if this was a faulty version, copy and pasted. All right, sorry. Blah, 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 blah. All right, so that poem brings out several ideas. 1, we're headed for hard times. 2, we need to be living closer to the land. 3, whether we believe it or not, whether we like it or not, if we are living in a safe area, we will most likely see vast numbers of refugees pouring out of the cities as the social infrastructure deteriorates in this country. And number 4, storage food, when we speak of storage food, needs to be utilizing the best method of food preservation that there is, and that is meat on the hoof and crops in the ground. It needs to be growing. Almost the threat of famine. Back in the 1830s, Joseph Smith made a prophecy. He said that the area of southwest Missouri would be so flooded with refugees that there would almost be the threat of famine. It was not because the land was not capable of producing enough food for such a massive amount of people, but because you just can't store enough food for the vast numbers he saw coming as refugees. Yes, there should be food storage, but the main part of your food storage needs to be crops or growing food. You have a transition time. No matter what one may believe about Joseph Smith or the Mormon Church in general, this statement has a lot of wisdom and foresight in it, and I would also point out that were it not for the Mormon movement, the Mormon Church, there would be precious little capability in this country in the way of food storage technology. So that is one part of the big picture I saw 10 years ago. Had this area of food production and food preservation, long-term food storage, been left to the churches of general Christendom with their rapture theology or their preterism theology, their futurisms and their pastisms, there would be no long-term food storage plants anywhere in America. So that is what we will be faced with, refugees or homeless people. When, not if, judgment begins in this country, we are going to see some massive amounts of changes. as they come into a part of the country that I believe will be ruled by God's law, and this is an area we're going to cover briefly, what area of the country to go to. That was in parentheses. Things are going to change. Life is going to be very different. We can refuse to be a part of the solution, but in so doing, we will be making ourselves a part of the problem. We need to be as prepared as possible. As many people as possible need to do things ahead of time. In other words, we need to do these things now. It is virtually too late now, but a lot of good can still be done. A lot of preparation and groundwork can still be laid. And so we need to have the utmost in cooperation. We do not need to have perfect doctrine. We do not need to have the splitting of hairs and the arguing and the screaming and yelling about doctrinal points of view. We need to work, and work together. One of this country's founding fathers stated, "Gentlemen, we shall either hang together or we will most assuredly hang separately." May I suggest that an untold amount of suffering could be avoided by cooperative preparedness. Okay. And I'm going to go just a couple more, few quick comments since I read that. Okay, I did good. Only paused a couple times, interjected a couple things. Okay, I'm going to start right there. We either hang together or we hang separately. And I quote that, but I don't do it very often. And that struck me because that's exactly my message, and it's what I said earlier, or in one of the things I did tonight. We need to work together. We need to, everybody, either everybody that's meant to make it through this time, this the dark forces window of time, as phraseology from the book, the series of books. The first book is called Anastasia, the series of books called The Ringing Cedars of Russia. Very strange books, actually the strangest books I've ever read in my entire life, and that's saying a lot. Stranger than science fiction, I think. But anyway, the dark forces window of time. It is my desire, it is my goal, it is my plan, it is my vision, as it was in this story, these books about this woman Anastasia from the Russian taiga, Siberia, I guess, to carry, to take, to bring as many people through the dark forces window of time as possible. So, but what I'm saying here is that this is exactly this quote, Benjamin Franklin, or whoever, will either hang together or we will most assuredly hang separately. Whoever and however many of us is destined to come through a time in our history, and I'm not saying, there may be little areas of the country, God can keep people alive anywhere. There's Hell's Canyon in Idaho, and there's a canyon down in the Four Corners area, and there's a lot of little places like that. But when you're talking the bulk of the people of this nation, if we're invaded from all four borders, both coasts, both borders, there's only one place for people to go, and that's inland. Look in every century, in every country, in every continent, in every island, in every place of the world. When you're invaded, you go away from the invasion. And that's inland. Hello. And we just happen to have two borders and two coasts, as do most countries. Some people, like, Germany has, just all one border. But anyway, so I think it's going to get down to the place where Jesus said, except the elect, except those days would be shortened, no one would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days were shortened, and I think that's exactly what is going to happen. Supernaturally, exactly as seen in George Washington's vision, the days will be shortened. Angelic hosts will come and rescue us, as possibly Angelicos rescued Britain when the Luftwaffe was heading over for the last time, and London had no fighters left, and there was no hope, and there was nothing left, and they had no capability of defense, and they were about to capitulate, and they would have to surrender. And the bombers turned around and went back the other direction, went back to Germany. Now, supposedly Hitler called them back with some occultic, demonic, whatever, or maybe whatever happened. They supposedly went back, but the story was that they saw thousands and thousands and thousands of white planes, and they turned around and went back. So, story. Maybe it's just a story. I like it. Blood River, war truckers, Africa, being assaulted by thousands upon thousands of enemy, and they actually knew they were going to be, if God did not protect them and defend them, they would be slaughtered. And they vowed a solemn vow to for all of time to commemorate that day. They fasted and prayed before the battle, and they commemorated that day as a day that they would remember forever in history. And there's a monument there that you can go to, because after 2 or 3 waves of attack, and they were about out of ammunition, the natives left. And why did they leave? Because of the 7-foot white warriors. So, again, they were down to virtually their last bullet. They had very little capability of defense, and they were going to be overwhelmed and slaughtered, men, women, children, several hundred. Or maybe it was a punitive expedition, it was just men probably. Anyway, situation like that, I think it's going to happen again. So, alright, that's it. This is Jerry Diamond. I'm going to read my book. And just if you're listening to this, you are the remnant.